Blacklists weren't just for spies and politicians. They hit the entertainment world like a hammer too. Imagine starring in a lavish costume drama one week, then being told you'll never work again the next. Sounds unreal, right? But it happened. Careers were frozen, reputations crushed, and actors vanished from screens overnight. So, what period dramas led straight to the blacklist? Let's pull back the velvet curtain and take a look at the stories no one wanted told. Jean Muir. Here's a gut punch of a story. Jean Muir was poised for TV stardom in the 1950s. She was cast in The Aldrich Family, a squeaky clean American sitcom that dressed itself in old-fashioned charm, complete with wholesome values and cozy suburbia vibes. But one thing about wholesome America back then, it came with a blacklist attached. When Muir's name appeared in the notorious pamphlet Red Channels, she was branded un-American. Not for anything she did on screen, she wasn't pushing radical storylines or tearing up scripts, but because she signed petitions and joined organizations that were later accused of leaning left. That was enough to end her career. Sponsors panicked, letters poured in, and NBC quietly cut her from the show before a single season wrapped. The irony? The Aldrich Family was the kind of lightweight series that practically begged for a safe actress like Muir. But the blacklist didn't care about irony. Her firing sparked outrage, with fans sending in support, but the damage stuck. Muir became the first high-profile casualty of Hollywood's blacklist era, and the series trudged on without her. The kicker, she was never proven guilty of anything. No charges, no crimes, just whispers and suspicion. Her career, once a promising arc through Broadway and film, hit a wall so high she never fully scaled it again. That's the cruelty of the blacklist. 1 minute you're the star of a cozy family period piece. The next, you're radioactive. Lee Grant. Lee Grant's blacklist story feels like a cruel bait and switch. She burst onto the scene in Detective Story 1951, a gritty, noir-style period piece with Kirk Douglas. Her performance lit up the screen, earning her an Academy Award nomination. For an actress in her 20s, that should have been the start of a meteoric rise. But what happened? HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, came knocking. Grant attended the funeral of J. Edward Bromberg, another blacklisted actor, and gave a fiery eulogy condemning the witch hunt. That single act was enough to land her on the wrong side of the industry. She refused to name names when called before HUAC, and that silence cost her 12 years of work in Hollywood. Think about it, 12 years in an era when leading ladies had a short shelf life already. Instead of climbing the ladder, Grant was forced to scrape by with theater work and the occasional small gig under pseudonyms. Meanwhile, Detective Story became a period classic, remembered as a sharp window into mid-century corruption. The cruel irony? The film still got celebrated, while the actress who helped power it was quietly erased. But here's where the narrative shifts. Lee Grant staged a comeback in the 1960s, snagged another Oscar nomination for The Landlord, and finally won in 1975 for Shampoo. She also reinvented herself as a director, earning respect behind the camera. Her blacklist years were stolen from her, yes, but she clawed her way back. Still, those lost years hang over her story like a ghost. Imagine a young star at her peak, ripped off the stage not because of her work, but because of her words. That's Lee Grant's legacy, a cautionary tale about how period drama glory could dissolve overnight in blacklist America. Mady Christians. Mady Christians' downfall reads like a dark chapter in Hollywood's blacklist handbook. Born in Vienna and trained on the European stage, she brought an aristocratic presence to her roles. By the 1940s, she'd landed in Hollywood, most memorably appearing in Watch on the Rhine, a period drama adapted from Lillian Hellman's play about resisting fascism. It was the kind of prestige project that should have secured her a long career. Instead, it became her swan song. Christians was politically outspoken, a woman who didn't hold her tongue about fascism, about politics, about injustice. That didn't play well in Cold War America. When Red Channels was published in 1950, her name was there in black ink. Almost overnight, she was unhireable. The chilling part, the very themes she championed, resisting tyranny, standing up for freedom, were suddenly recast as suspicious. Watch on the Rhine itself was a patriotic drama, one that showcased the dangers of authoritarianism. But in the paranoia-soaked 1950s, roles like that became double-edged swords. Christians, once celebrated for embodying strength and integrity on stage and screen, found herself under the very cloud she had warned about in her art. Her career collapsed, roles dried up, the Hollywood doors slammed shut. She never fully recovered, dying in 1951, with her career still in ruins. Today, she's a footnote in Blacklist history, but her story has a cruel symmetry. The actress who helped tell audiences to be brave in the face of tyranny was silenced by her own industry's tyranny of fear. It's a brutal reminder that sometimes the very dramas meant to showcase virtue ended up being death sentences for the people inside them. Victor Killian. Victor Killian wasn't a household name, but you knew his face. He had one of those character actor careers. The loyal sidekick, the gruff townsman, the kindly uncle. He appeared in classics like The Adventures of Captain Marvel and countless period dramas that filled mid-century movie schedules. He wasn't flashy, but he was dependable, the kind of actor who made a production feel lived in, until the Blacklist erased him. Killian's trouble started with his membership in progressive organizations. He was active, vocal, and unafraid to join causes that later got flagged as suspicious. That landed him squarely in HUAC's sights. The result? He was yanked off Hollywood's call sheets, relegated to obscurity during the height of his working years. What makes Killian's story sting is the way the Blacklist treated character actors like him. Big stars sometimes had the money and clout to weather the storm, but middle-tier performers, those who made up the fabric of period dramas, were simply discarded. He lost not just roles, but stability, and for a while, it looked like his career might be gone for good. He found refuge on stage, thanks to Actors' Equity, which resisted Blacklist pressures more than Hollywood did. Eventually, he clawed back some TV work in the 1970s, even appearing in All in the Family. But the damage was already done. Decades of prime years had vanished. Here's the kicker. Killian loved the craft. He didn't want stardom, just steady work. The Blacklist robbed him of that simple ambition. For a man who spent his life enriching other people's stories, his own ended up defined by the cruelty of the industry he served, Charlie Chaplin. You didn't think we'd skip Chaplin, did you? The most famous man in silent cinema, the little tramp himself, brought the world laughter and pathos in equal measure. By the 1950s, though, Chaplin was no longer just a beloved comic genius. He was a political target. And his downfall played out around Limelight 1952, a period piece drenched in nostalgia that would ironically become his Hollywood farewell. Limelight was about an aging clown mentoring a young dancer. It was bittersweet, a reflection of Chaplin's own fading stardom and his longing for the golden days of performance. But behind the curtain, the FBI had been watching him for years. J. Edgar Hoover saw Chaplin as a threat, branding him a leftist sympathizer. His refusal to become a U.S. citizen only made the attacks louder. When Chaplin sailed to Europe for the London premiere of Limelight, the U.S. government revoked his re-entry permit. Imagine that, one of the most iconic figures in film history, locked out of the very country that made him famous. He spent the rest of his life in Switzerland, effectively exiled, while Limelight itself was suppressed in American theaters for decades. Chaplin never made another film in Hollywood. His blacklist wasn't official in the Red Channel sense, but it was just as devastating. The industry turned its back, not because he lost his talent, but because he refused to bow to political paranoia. The irony is almost poetic. A film about an old entertainer's forced exit became the very stage where Chaplin himself made his last Hollywood bow. It's a reminder that even giants weren't safe when the blacklist machine was in full swing. Orson Welles. Orson Welles should have been unstoppable. By the time he made his version of Macbeth in 1948, he had already rewritten cinema with Citizen Kane and carved out a reputation as the enfant terrible of Hollywood. His Macbeth, set in a brooding, fog-drenched medieval Scotland, was bold, experimental, and theatrical in every sense. But behind all that Shakespearean gloom lurked another specter, the FBI. Welles was politically outspoken, aligning himself with leftist causes and speaking against racism and fascism during the 1930s and 40s. Noble, yes. Dangerous in Cold War America? Absolutely. The House Un-American Activities Committee started sniffing around his associations, and the studio system, already uneasy with Welles' uncompromising nature, began to distance itself. Here's the tragic twist. While Macbeth should have been a showcase of his genius in period storytelling, critics pounced on it as chaotic, and the blacklist machinery turned his politics into poison. By 1948, Welles had left the U.S. altogether, setting up camp in Europe to keep making films like Othello and Chimes at midnight. He was never formally charged with anything, but suspicion was enough. America lost one of its most innovative filmmakers to political paranoia. Macbeth went down as a messy Shakespeare experiment, but the real mess was how Hollywood let fear drive one of its brightest minds out the door. Welles's story shows the blacklist didn't just erase actors, it chased out visionaries, leaving period dramas like Macbeth as eerie reminders of what he might have done if the industry had given him the freedom he deserved. Leonard Bernstein. You don't usually think of a conductor as a blacklist casualty, but Leonard Bernstein wasn't just any maestro. By the late 1940s, he was America's musical golden boy. His young people's concerts on CBS turned him into a cultural icon, blending classical music with accessible period-style storytelling that captivated TV audiences. But that fame also painted a target on his back. Bernstein had been active in leftist causes, championing civil rights and hosting fundraisers. When Red Channels dropped in 1950, his name was right there. Suddenly, the networks panicked. CBS demanded he sign a humiliating affidavit swearing he wasn't a communist. Without it, his concerts, the very thing that made him a national treasure, would be yanked off the air. It wasn't just TV either. The U.S. State Department even denied him a passport in 1951, effectively blacklisting him from conducting abroad. Imagine being the face of America's music scene, but told you couldn't represent America anywhere outside its borders. The irony burned. Bernstein eventually survived the storm. He signed the affidavit reluctantly and kept working. Later, his score for West Side Story made him immortal. But those blacklist years cost him dearly, stifling his career at a time when he should have been expanding his influence internationally. The bizarre part? His young people's concerts were the definition of wholesome educational programming, period dramas for music lovers. Yet, paranoia doesn't care about wholesomeness. Bernstein's crime was compassion, and it nearly ended the career of one of the greatest cultural figures of the 20th century. Lena Horne. Lena Horne was elegance personified. A singer, actress, and civil rights activist, she carved her place in Hollywood with roles like Cabin in the Sky, 1943, one of the few period musicals with a predominantly black cast. She brought glamour and grit, refusing to play the stereotyped roles studios shoved at black women. But her refusal came at a cost. Horne used her fame to speak out against segregation. She worked with groups like the NAACP, toured military bases but demanded desegregated audiences, and didn't shy away from criticizing racism in the industry itself. Admirable, right? Not to Hugh ask. Her activism, combined with friendships in progressive circles, led to her being labeled politically suspect. During the 1950s, her name floated into blacklist territory. TV networks grew skittish, film offers dried up, and for years, she was effectively sidelined. The tragedy is that while other stars of her caliber were headlining period dramas and musicals, Horne was forced back into nightclub circuits just to keep performing. Hollywood's loss was America's loss. She could have become one of the defining actresses of her generation, but her career was trimmed down because she insisted on basic dignity and equality. Eventually, Horne made a triumphant return with her one-woman Broadway show in the 1980s, proving she'd never lost her power. Still, the blacklist years robbed her of film roles that might have been legendary. Cabin in the Sky stands as a bittersweet reminder of what she gave the screen and what the industry refused to give back. Burgess Meredith. You probably know Burgess Meredith as Mickey, the gruff trainer from Rocky, but rewind to the 1930s and 40s, and he was one of Hollywood's rising stars. His performance as George in Of Mice and Men. 1939 remains one of the most haunting period drama portrayals of the Depression era. He brought a raw humanity to Steinbeck's tale that critics adored, but then came HUAC. Meredith's politics leaned left, and he didn't hide it. That was enough for suspicion to cloud his career. By the early 1950s, his name had been dragged into blacklist circles. He was dropped from projects, and his once steady career ground to a halt. For 7 years, one of the best character actors of his time couldn't land meaningful film roles. The irony? Of Mice and Men was about compassion and survival in harsh times. Exactly the kind of story that resonated with audiences facing economic struggles. Yet, the man who helped bring that story to life was punished for holding similar compassionate views in real life. Meredith survived by turning back to theater and eventually television, but those prime years were stolen. By the time he returned to the screen in full force, he was older, relegated to character roles rather than leading man territory. His Blacklist story underscores the absurdity of the era. Hollywood shelved a talent who could transform period drama into something raw and unforgettable, all because paranoia mattered more than performance. Edward G. Robinson. Edward G. Robinson had one of the most distinctive faces in Hollywood. Famous for his gangster roles, yes, but he also proved his dramatic chops in period pieces like All My Sons, 1948, Arthur Miller's searing post-war morality play. He should have been untouchable, respected, versatile, and bankable. Instead, suspicion turned him into a blacklist casualty. Robinson was politically active, donating to liberal causes and lending his voice to anti-fascist efforts during World War II. Noble in wartime, but suddenly suspect in the Cold War. He was never formally blacklisted in the Red Channels sense, but the industry quietly pushed him aside. He lost leading roles, relegated to second-tier parts, despite still having the talent and recognition of a star. At one point, Robinson testified before HUAC, trying to clear his name. But even that didn't fully save him. For a while, the work slowed to a crawl, and his once commanding screen presence was reduced to scraps. It's a cruel irony. All My Sons was about morality, corruption, and responsibility. Robinson's performance embodied those themes, yet Hollywood punished him for exercising his own moral responsibility in politics. He eventually clawed back his reputation, winning an honorary Academy Award late in his life. But by then, the years of leading roles were gone. Robinson's story proves how suspicion didn't need proof. It only needed a whisper to bring a giant down. John Garfield. John Garfield wasn't just a movie star, he was a symbol of the working-class underdog. In films like Body and Soul, 1947, a boxing period drama that punched through America's post-war anxieties, he embodied grit and vulnerability in equal measure. Audiences loved him because he wasn't a polished matinee idol. He was raw, flawed, and real. But authenticity didn't save him when HUAC came calling. Garfield was outspoken about his politics, supporting liberal causes and refusing to toe the party line. When dragged before the committee, he did something brave and costly. He refused to name names. That single decision, noble as it was, branded him as uncooperative. Studios cut him loose. His career went into freefall, just as he should have been cementing his legacy as one of Hollywood's greatest actors. The tragedy? Garfield was only in his late 30s, with decades of work ahead of him. Body and Soul should have been the launching pad for a long career of prestige dramas. Instead, he was left scrambling for independent work, while his health deteriorated under the stress of surveillance and suspicion. By the time he died in 1952, his reputation had been smeared, his career gutted, and his legacy tarnished by politics. Watching Body and Soul now feels almost prophetic, the story of a man exploited and crushed by forces larger than himself. Garfield wasn't just playing a boxer fighting the system, he was living it. Burl Ives. Burl Ives is remembered today as the folksy singer with the booming voice, the man who gave us holiday classics like A Holly Jolly Christmas. But rewind to the 1940s, and Ives was also carving out a serious career as a film actor. In period dramas like Smoky 1946, a western about a cowboy and his horse, he was building the kind of steady career that could stretch across decades, until Red Channels came along. In 1950, his name was listed in the infamous publication that outed entertainers as communist sympathizers. That was enough to send his Hollywood career into a nosedive. Studios panicked, roles evaporated, and suddenly this versatile performer was sidelined. He denied the charges, even testified before HUAC, but the damage was done. For years, Burl Ives was toxic in the industry he'd worked so hard to break into. The blacklist was especially cruel to multi-talented artists like him. Singing could keep him afloat, but his acting, the thing he was starting to make his mark in, was kneecapped. He spent years on the fringes until the 1960s, when he staged a comeback with Cat on a hot tin roof in the big country, finally winning an Oscar. But the lost time was gone. Smokey and his early films feel like relics of a career that almost never was. For Ives, the blacklist wasn't a complete erasure, but it was a detour that nearly destroyed what should have been a smoother rise to stardom. Uta Hagen, The Other Shore of Broadway. If you know acting teachers, you know Uta Hagen. She trained generations of performers, wrote Respect for Acting, and became a legend of the stage. But before she was Broadway's grande dame, she was a promising screen actress. Her work in films like The Other Shore and stage adaptations of Chekhov positioned her as a serious talent ready to cross into Hollywood period dramas. Then came the blacklist. In 1950, Red Channels slapped her name in its pages, branding her as suspect. Hagen wasn't just political, she was outspoken, refusing to keep her beliefs quiet. That independence, admirable in art, made her toxic in a paranoid industry. The result? Roles dried up almost instantly. Instead of a glittering film career, Hagen retreated to teaching, pouring her energy into training the next generation of actors. It's ironic. The blacklist tried to silence her, but instead it amplified her influence. Her students included names like Matthew Broderick and Sigourney Weaver, actors who carried her methods into Hollywood long after her own chances there were stolen. Hagen's blacklist story shows another side of the tragedy. She wasn't erased, but redirected. Period dramas lost an actress who could have delivered powerhouse performances on screen. What they got instead was a teacher who changed the craft from behind the scenes. Still, you can't help but wonder what her name might have meant in Hollywood history had she not been blacklisted. Zero Mostel. Zero Mostel had one of those faces you don't forget, expressive, mischievous, larger than life. On stage, he was electric, especially in musicals like Fiddler on the Roof, and a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum. But rewind to the blacklist era, and you'll see a man whose career was nearly strangled before it could reach its full bloom. Mostel's crime, outspoken politics, association with progressive causes, and a refusal to cave when HUAC demanded cooperation. The result was brutal. For years, he was shut out of Hollywood. His film career, which should have flourished in the 1950s, was stalled. He scraped by on stage, doing cabaret and small gigs, before eventually reclaiming his status as one of Broadway's titans. The ultimate irony came in 1976, when he starred in The Front, a period drama about writers and performers destroyed by the blacklist. Mostel played a blacklisted comic who has to front for others just to work, essentially reliving his own story on screen. It was biting, meta, and cathartic, a way of exposing the blacklist's cruelty while also laughing at its absurdity. Zero Mostel's story isn't just about loss, it's about defiance. He refused to be erased, refused to let the blacklist have the final word. But it still robbed him of years when he could have been electrifying screens instead of waiting in the shadows. Gale Sondergaard. Gale Sondergaard had one of those careers that seemed unstoppable. She burst into Hollywood in the 1930s, making history as the very first winner of the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for Anthony Adverse. By the late 30s, she was a fixture in period dramas, often cast as mysterious, aristocratic women. In The Life of Émile Zola, 1937, she stood out in a film that went on to win Best Picture, showcasing the kind of gravitas that made her indispensable to historical storytelling. But the blacklist didn't spare Oscar winners. Sondergaard was married to director Herbert Biberman, one of the infamous Hollywood 10. When he refused to testify before HUAC and went to prison, Sondergaard stood by him. That loyalty, admirable in any other context, effectively destroyed her career. She was one of the first actresses to be blacklisted, and unlike some who managed comebacks, she was nearly erased from the screen entirely. What makes her story sting is how much was lost. Sondergaard was once slated to play the Wicked Witch of the West in The Wizard of Oz before the role shifted to Margaret Hamilton. She was seen as a go-to actress for grand, villainous, or complex roles in period dramas, the kind of parts that demanded presence and subtlety. After the Blacklist, all of that vanished. She didn't return to film until the late 1960s, decades after her prime had passed. By then, her contemporaries had cemented their legacies, while hers had been shattered by politics. The Life of Émile Zola remains a powerful period piece, but it's also a haunting reminder of the star it helped launch and the silence that followed. Sondergaard's story closes the circle on this list. Proof that the Blacklist wasn't just about politics. It was about punishing loyalty, silencing artistry, and burying legacies that should have shone for generations. So, there you have it. 15 stories where the velvet world of period dramas collided with the cold steel of the Blacklist. Careers ended, reputations shattered, and legacies warped by politics instead of talent. But here's the real question. How many more voices were silenced before we even got to hear them? Drop your thoughts below, hit subscribe if you want more hidden Hollywood history, and tell me, whose Blacklist story shocked you the most?